and welcome to the 82nd session of the Porous Media Tea Time Talks as part of the InterPore Young Academy. I'm very excited to welcome two great speakers today. And without further ado, I shall get started with our first speaker, Xukang Lu. He received his BS and PhD degrees from the Department of Engineering Mechanics at Tsinghua University and will soon join the Department of Materials at ETH Zurich as a postdoctoral researcher. His research focuses on particle transport and multiphase flow in microfluidic systems and porous media, combining multi-scale experiments and modeling to uncover mechanisms governing complex particle dynamics and their implications for flow control. He has published over 10 peer-reviewed papers in leading journals such as PNAS, Journal of Fluid Mechanics, and Water Resources Research. So without further ado, I shall hand over the floor to you.
Okay, thank you. Let me turn on the laser. So is everything great on the screen?
It looks great, yeah.
Okay, thank you. Hello, everyone. I'm Xukang Lu from Tsinghua University. And actually, as Catherine has just introduced, I will soon move to ETH as a postdoc. And I would like to first thank Porous Media Tea Time Talks team for their kind invitation, and also Catherine for hosting this session. So my presentation today is about wettability changes via nanoparticle adsorption across scales from interfacial wetting behaviors to multiphase displacement in porous media. Here is an outline of the presentation. The first part, introduction. So tuning wettability is critical in diverse scenarios. In porous media, it is highly relevant to multiphase flow and some bacterial transport, and they will have a lot of applications in across scenarios like filtration, soil remediation, hydrocarbon recovery. And beyond porous media, tuning wettability is obviously a fundamental scientific problem involved in self-cleaning, droplet control, etc. So here are some conventional methods for wettability manipulation, or maybe we should say the most widely used methods. The first one is chemical modification. People just use surfactants or specialized agents, which essentially change these surface energy terms. And the disadvantages are very clear. The chemical agents can be unstable, they can be easily flushed away, leading to failure of the modification, and they may have toxicity. The second one is surface patterning, which is more and more popular nowadays. So basically, we just fabricate these microtextures on the surface, leading to super wetting states. But the fabrication can be sophisticated with fixed property. And more importantly, such surface patterning is inapplicable in natural systems, like in subsurface media, in human bodies with porous media. Actually, we cannot reach there and modify the surface. So treatment via nanoparticle suspensions maybe provide an alternative perspective. So we can just inject the suspensions into such porous media systems, and then the surface will be in contact with the suspension, and then the particles will spontaneously adsorb onto it, driven by concentration gradient. And also it is a post-processing method, but it can create stable morphology change by those solid particles compared to chemical methods. But there are many knowledge gaps regarding this topic. So the first one is the quantitative relationship between adsorption condition, kinetics, and the wettability variation. There are a lot of characterizations showing how the performance is great, but the quantitative link is lacking. And the major concern here is actually the controversy over size effects. Particle size is probably the most important factor we need to consider. And we have noticed that in literature, people have reported different size effects under different conditions, and they proposed some interpretations that may contradict with each other. And the impacts of salinity, surface property, and treatment condition, all important for adsorption, have not been fully understood. So in terms of multiphase flow control, here actually we are talking about just inject these nanoparticle suspensions to displace the non-aqueous phase trapped in porous media and try to improve the displacement efficiency, which can be useful for like oil recovery and contaminant removal. According to literature, we find so many inconsistencies in this displacement performance. So the first factor is intrinsic wettability. Generally, we find that better performance is usually reported in hydrophilic media, but the mechanisms governing such transitions and also the quantitative criteria remain unclear and debated. The second thing is about the structure property. People may use many different pore structures in their experiments, like natural sand packs, regular micromodels, and heterogeneous micromodels, and the performance may vary, but the link between structure property and such performance change remain unclear. So our motivation is very straightforward, just how to achieve efficient and robust wettability alteration by nanoparticle absorption on solid surfaces. At the interfacial scale, we aim to figure out the optimal treatment condition, and at the Pore-scale, we aim to figure out the influencing factors on multiphase displacement and flow processes. Now we move to the interfacial wetting behaviors. This part is a little bit microscopic, but it forms the basis of the displacement processes. So here's an experimental design. We just immerse the substrate into an aqueous suspension environment so that particles can adsorb onto it. And we first characterize the wettability using the apparent contact angle of the aqueous phase. So a smaller theta means a more hydrophilic state. And simultaneously, we characterize the surface morphology by macroscopic SEM. We can see how particles are distributed on the surface, and we can do statistics of the surface coverage evolution. So we consider two different treatment conditions. So the first one is a saturated state in suspension environment corresponding to maximum capacity. And the second one is the final state when re-immersion in water to evaluate its robustness. Then we look at, here are the detailed experimental conditions. And because of the time limit, I won't go into them too much, but basically we just vary the salt concentration and surface charge conditions, which are very important for interactions between particles and the surface, and also particles and particles. So you can imagine that when we have both repulsion very strong, then adsorption will be very difficult to occur, and thus wettability alteration will be influenced. And as we vary the salt concentration and also change the surface charge, we will have these different colloidal interaction modes from unfavorable to favorable. And we just select 3 representative conditions to investigate the trend. And for nanoparticle suspensions, we basically fix all the other parameters, control them, and just vary the particle size over a wide range. And zeta potential may change corresponding to physiochemical conditions, and also the surface may be modified under different conditions. And then we just look at the summary of the results. If we plot the apparent wettability versus the particle size under different adsorption conditions, you will see so many different size effects. So it is variable, relevant to in respect to the treatment condition and also the adsorption condition. So sometimes it's non-monotonic, sometimes smaller particles performs better, and sometimes it's minimum effect, and sometimes larger is better. And even more importantly, if we summarize all these results together, we will find an indeterminate size range that consistently benefits wettability variation. And this is something exciting for applications, because then if we can identify and predict this optimal range, then people can just use it in a relatively safe way, and they don't have to consider too much complex factors. And also, we have evaluated the aging effects. So basically, the results are relatively general without time sensitivity. And then we try to predict it and quantify it. So the first step is to exclude all the other factors. So we make sure that solid surface adsorption dominates during this process. And for the model development, the first part is the wetting model, is about the relationship between the wettability change and how particles are distributed on the surface. So finally, we can extract the relationship between the apparent contact angle and the surface coverage, which is measurable from experiments, as we introduced before. And then we have this non-trivial relationship, and it fits well with the experimental data. But you can see the data distribution is kind of sparse and scattering. So it does not uniformly distribute it through the along the theoretical line, and that is induced by the microscopic adsorption kinetic feature. So for the adsorption kinetics, it is a little bit complicated, but here the essential physics is a diffusion process driven by the concentration gradient, and it is strongly affected by particle wall and interparticle interactions. So the first step is to improve these descriptions. We just try to calculate the interaction energy accurately, and then we derive the critical formulations for the diffusive flux, for the surface blocking effect, and also like the characteristic time for the desorption. And here I want to introduce this curve in detail because it is directly relevant to the key mechanism dominating the non-monotonic effect. So here is a typical particle wall interaction energy curve calculated from the extended DLVU theory. We have three different kinds of forces and summarize them together. So it is a non-monotonic trend. And for a particle that is approaching the surface, actually it first has to overcome this repulsive barrier. And usually a larger particle will have a higher repulsive barrier, and so the efficiency will be induced at a larger particle size. And after this repulsive barrier, the particle will fall into this potential well, and that means it is actually adsorbed. But that doesn't mean it's permanently fixed. So when the you can imagine that when the well is shallower, maybe the particle will escape from the surface and lead to instability. And that usually happens at a smaller particle size. So you can see that here is a computation, and this computation is highly size relevant. And then with all this framework, we can do the quantitative predictions about everything from coverage evolution to wettability evolution, and we compare our model predictions with experiments which fit well. But the whole process here is quite complicated. And for practical applications, people may want something simpler and more straightforward to just use it and just give the optimal condition. So we further try to develop some generalized criteria theoretically. So the first step is to extract this dimensionless phase diagram describing the dominant competing mechanism for the non-monotonic size effect. As we have explained before, it's computation between the efficiency and the stability determined by the repulsive barrier and the potential well, and the predicted optimal regime fit well with all different experimental data. And the second step, we formulate a comprehensive dimensionless number, and by calculating this number, and when it is larger than 1, we can just directly determine the optimal regime, which means we can just tell people what is the optimal size. And even beyond size, as we show here, we have this dimensionless group description for the system. With any of the 3 dimensionless parameters fixed, we can determine the left one. You can see physiochemical properties and also wettability conditions. So it is relatively a general criteria. And we have validated it regarding the optimal size prediction against so many different experimental systems. And with all this, we start to think about how it works for displacement in porous media. It seems that we have obtained all the optimal conditions, but actually still many factors have not been considered. So let's just evaluate it first under the optimal condition. And we first change the substrate wettability, which is common in applications and also actually in our following microfluidic experiments. So you can see the strong wettability alteration can be observed under all different conditions, and it agrees well with theory. But when we change another thing, the whole game seems to be changed. So that is the phase configuration. Previously, we just consider a non-aqueous droplet deposited onto a substrate immersed in the aqueous environment, so that particles will first adsorb onto it uniformly, and then we have the wettability change. But if we flip the process, you can see we have this failure. Nanoparticles play negligible role in wettability alteration just within the arrow bar. And if we look at these 2 phase configurations carefully, actually the aqueous droplet condition is closer to displacement to some extent. So basically we have some regions occupied by the non-aqueous phase, and we want the aqueous phase to enter there. But intuitively, as you can see from this illustration, there's no motivation for these particles to enter there, so that their absorption is basically restricted in the aqueous phase, and the 3-phase contact line is hardly affected. So that's the reason we have this failure. And so the next question is that, does that mean nanoparticles cannot help multiphase displacement? So of course the answer is wrong, otherwise we won't have the next part. But the key factor here is that we need some pre-film spreading to drive particles to enter there and then further change the local wettability. And for channel flow, we always have this corner flow when the surface is hydrophilic enough. For a rectangular channel, we have this 45-degree criteria. So that means the surface has to be hydrophilic already to promote this pre-existing film spreading so that nanoparticles can play their roles. And this is basically a hypothesis extracted from all these observations and analyses, and we will then validate it in porous media experiments. So we start from this complex porous structure we constructed with a very well-precise distribution, and we change the substrate wettability and say how the aqueous phase saturation SA varies under different conditions. So it basically corresponds to the displacement efficiency. And it is very clear that only when the corner flow criterion is satisfied, when the surface is already a little bit hydrophilic, the nanoparticles can induce a strong increase in this aqueous phase saturation. And when nanoparticles can play their roles, as shown by the animations here, you can see strong vacuum film development, non-aqueous phase detachment, and all this ganglion mobilization. The qualitative observations are consistent with our quantitative statistics of the topology evolution. So the next step is to investigate the structure properties, as we mentioned in the introduction. So we changed the pore structure using a self-developed algorithm. So basically, we adjust the ratio of the small grains and the large grains during the structure generation. And that's why we call them hierarchical structure. And naturally, this hierarchy will lead to wild pore-size distribution and even this long tail feature, which is strongly heterogeneous. And we can flexibly adjust it to like near Gaussian. And then we look at the performance in these different structures. So first, the corner flow criterion is always satisfied. So we always have this saturation increase only when this criterion is satisfied. And second, we see different performance in different structures. So basically, a stronger hierarchy, or we should say a stronger flow heterogeneity, will promote this saturation increase. And we try to analyze it from the qualitative comparison between the phase distribution and the flow field from simulations. So you can see clearly that the trapped droplets are basically released from the low velocity regions, the stagnant zones, while actually the local capillary number is very low and film flow is very strong, so that we have this film development and droplet detachment. And then we need to have these fingering passes so that this ganglia can be mobilized, because we have higher velocity there and corresponding higher capillary numbers there. So both statistics and qualitative observation agree with this interpretation that stronger flow heterogeneity will enhance both detachment and mobilization, leading to a better performance when we have nanoparticles. So finally, we have this illustrative phase diagram. So to say when nanoparticles can be efficient for multiphase flow control, we have two influencing factors: the structure characteristics quantified by this coefficient of variation, and the substrate intrinsic wettability because of the corner flow criteria. So generally, a more hydrophilic media and stronger flow heterogeneity will benefit nanoparticles to play their roles. And finally, I would like to show a small extension. So from this phase diagram, you would say the scenarios for nanoparticles is very limited, because when the surface is hydrophobic, it seems that they cannot play their roles. But we can also combine it with some other methods, like chemical-based methods. So we can just use some surfactants to modify the surface property to make it satisfy the corner flow criteria. And then nanoparticles can further play the structure effects. So here is a demo of this synergistic effect. So you can see the mixture system induced a much higher displacement efficiency increment compared to the pure nanoparticle or surfactant systems. So that's basically all the presentation. And finally, our two take-home messages. So for static wettability, we report a non-monotonic size effect on tuning wettability and establish quantitative criteria for prediction of all the optimal conditions. And for multiphase flow, we show that nanoparticle adsorption plays an important role only when the corner flow criterion is satisfied, and demonstrate the coupled impacts of both wettability and structure conditions. So here are some corresponding manuscripts and papers. So the multiphase flow part has been published in JFM. And that's all. Thank you very much. And I look forward to any further communication to my email. Yeah.
Great, thank you so much for that. If anyone in the audience has a question, you can type them out and post a comment, and I can read them out. But as the chair, I think I get the privilege of asking the questions I want to ask first. And so my first question was, I think it was slide 15. You had this dimensionless number, and I was wondering if you had any way to upscale that, because it had a lot of like micro scale features.
You mean like in a porous media to calculate the local condition, or?
Yes, exactly.
Okay. I think basically for this for this parameter, most of the microscopic parameters are basically the particle properties. So it's not something like restricted under microscopic conditions. Like for flow in a porous media, we always know the particle properties, right? And what we need actually from the media is just the substrate wettability. So I think the upscaling of this parameter should be feasible. Yeah.
And is there like a significant sensitivity to this number for like the advancing contact angle versus the receding contact angle? Like if you have some uncertainty in that, would you likely cross into a different regime?
You mean when because of the advancing and receding, it will change significantly or not? So that I think it is actually not that sensitive to wettability conditions, because the key factor here is probably the adsorption kinetics. And of course, wettability will change the quantitative results, but the general trend, it plays a minor effect. So I think advancing or receding will not influence it that significantly.
Okay, great. And one final question. I think it was slide 19.
Yes.
I think
this one.
Yes, one more slide. Yeah. Could you tell me what those capillary numbers are on the bottom? I think it's just a little bit too small.
Yeah. Actually, so here we define a local capillary number. Because of time, I didn't go into the details. So basically, we just extracted the pore network from the porous media we have generated, and we just calculate a single phase flow field to extract the characteristic velocity. And then at each pore threshold, we can calculate the local capillary number. And the reason we have these extremely low capillary numbers is that we have these stagnant zooms. So basically there is nearly no flow there. So because of those flow heterogeneity. Yeah.
And then you have the mobilization at like 10 to the -3 for the local capillary number.
Yes. So that basically corresponds to these fingering passes with relatively high velocity. So viscous force will be much stronger.
Great. All right. Thank you so much. In the interest of time, I'm going to thank you again for your lovely talk, and we shall move on to our next speaker. So let me just bring him up.
Okay, thank you.
Great. So our next speaker is Anith Mishra from the University of Melbourne. Oops. Apologies for a second. Okay, great. So his research looks at basalt, a common volcanic rock, and looking at it can serve as a secure long-term reservoir for storing carbon dioxide deep underground. He studies continental flood basalts from the Deccan traps, where natural secondary mineralization over millions of years has altered the rock's pore networks and reduced its storage capacity. Using an integrated workflow from micro-CT imaging and geochemical analysis at the microscale to geomechanical testing and field-scale numerical modeling, he evaluates how these altered basalts perform as CO2 reservoirs and whether techniques like hydraulic stimulation can reopen pathways for injection. So I will hand the floor over to you now, Anith. I'm looking forward to your presentation.
Well, thank you, Catherine, for the introduction and for the invitation to speak today. So today I want to walk you through a question that sits at the heart of scaling up basalt-based CO2 storage. That is, when a flood basalt has spent 65 million years of weathering and mineralization, has it lost its storage potential, or is it that the potential is just hidden and we can recover that? So I will take you through how we use micro-CT-based reconstruction to answer that for the Deccan traps, which is one of the most talked about unconventional storage options for geological carbon storage. And we also benchmarked it against a young and relatively unaltered analog from Australia from the newer volcanic province, which is situated in the southern part of Australia. And I would also like to discuss a bit about what that means for both storage capacity and hydraulic stimulation as a path forward. So the first question is, let me set up my pointer first. Why basalts? Well, basalts are because they are the most abundant rock types on Earth's crust. They are present everywhere. As we all know that the ocean surface is made up of basalts, and we have basalt provinces on the continents as well. And the presence of primary minerals such as olivine pyroxene and plagioclase allows basalt to sequester the carbon dioxide quickly into secondary carbonate minerals. And sometimes that happens in a relatively quick time span as opposed to the siliciclastic formations. Now, continental flood basalt province, like I said, present everywhere, and these are some of the most important continental flood basalt province in the world. So here we have the Deccan traps in India, we have the North Atlantic igneous province in Greenland and Iceland, we have the Columbia River flood basalt formations in the western part of USA, we have the Paranite and Teca in South America and Africa. Then we have the largest Siberian traps in Russia. And the continental flood basalts comes up with this architecture, and this architecture starts with a chilled base. This forms when the erupted lava actually comes in contact with the surface of the earth, so it forms a chilled margin. Then it followed by a relatively non-porous but sometimes highly fractured massive horizon, which we call the flow interior. And on the top we mostly have this vesicle rich horizon, and these vesicles are formed when the lava when the gases from the lava actually starts to escape from the lava flow. And this vesicle-rich horizon, which we call the flow tops, are of interest for carbon, for geological carbon storage, because these horizons are permeable and we can inject CO2 in these horizons. And these injected CO2 can ultimately form these secondary carbonates within the vesicles. And this is why the basalts are mostly talked about. But one interesting aspect that gets less attention is that the flood basalt province are millions of years old. So naturally, the basalts are very reactive, and when they are millions of years old and suffering the weathering and alteration for millions of years, sometimes it can have lots of secondary minerals precipitated already within these open spaces. So what can we do with those basalts? So now coming to the Deccan traps. The Deccan traps is like one of the largest continental flood basalt provinces with an areal extent of more than 500,000 square kilometer, average thickness of 1,500 meters, formed during the Cretaceous Tertiary mass extinction around 65 million years, primarily tholeiitic in composition, which is calcium rich, and one of the most discussed unconventional reservoir for carbon storage. And one report by the government of India have actually indicated that these basalts can have a storage capacity, a theoretical storage capacity, to be honest, in the range of 97 to 315 gigatons of CO2. Now, the studies done on the Deccan traps, particularly from the angle of geological carbon storage, were mostly restricted to superficial samples because deeper subsurface samples were not available. And for the same reason, because nobody actually drilled through the Deccan traps, because the Deccan traps does not have any oil or gas potential. But in 2012, Ministry of Earth Science actually drilled 9 exploratory boreholes in the main Deccan Plateau region, which is here, which is close to Mumbai. And this was done to investigate the subsurface of the Deccan trap, not the Deccan trap. So this was done to investigate the granitoid basement that we have underneath the Deccan trap. But we actually utilized this study. We have made a collaboration with the Ministry of Earth Sciences in India, and we studied the recovered core samples. And when we studied the core samples, what we saw is this. So you can see that there are already pre-mineralized secondary minerals within the vesicles and the pore network of the Deccan traps. Then we collected these core samples. We did the micro CT scans to volumetrically render the different components. So this is the raw image. This is the volumetric portion of basalt. This is the portion occupied by secondary minerals. This is the vesicle network from 2 different samples. So these are like the 2 different representative samples here. We have collected a total of 20 samples or so. But I'm not going to share all of it here because of the time constraint. But when we tried to see the connectivity in the vesicle network, we find nothing. So there is no connectivity present at the core scale for these basalt samples. Now, we are also investigating the newer volcanic province in Australia, which is situated in the southern part of Australia. So this is Melbourne. So this is just a rough estimation where the newer volcanic province is. So the newer volcanic province we are investigating because it could represent an unmineralized analog for the Deccan traps, although the nature and the style of eruption between the Deccan traps and the newer volcanic province is very, very different. But particularly from the angle of vesicle formation and the gas escape, because the gas escape and the vesicle formation, vesicle coalescence and the migration follows the same laws of physics, we think that these basalts could be an unmineralized analog for the Deccan traps. So in simple words, this is what the Deccan traps might have looked like 65 million years back. But whether it is a one-to-one substitution, that is debatable. So I'm not going into there, but it's just an analog. So this is how it is to be seen. Then we analyze these basalts as well. So this is the first sample that we got. So since we do not have any secondary mineralization in these basalts, so volumetric rendering only come up with the basalt and the vesicle network. And here we try to see the connectivity. We found some connectivity. And we also kind of quantified the volumetric component. So in this particular sample, the basalt is 83%, the vesicles constitute 16%, and the vesicle connectivity is 3%, but the connectivity is only found along X. So no connectivity found along Z, which is the vertical dimension in here. For the second one, we did the same, and we found a much better connectivity. And here actually we found some connectivity along Z. So with these examples, what we can see here is that the pore network and the vesicle structure of basalts is highly heterogeneous in nature. And to address this nature of heterogeneity, we need to come up with something called a representative elementary volume. So representative elementary volume is the smallest volume of a heterogeneous material, which we need to measure the property so that it represents the entire system. And there's a very beautiful diagram which actually gives a very basic understanding of what an REV is. So basically, if we keep on going to the microscopic scale, we will see a very high fluctuation in heterogeneity of any of the parameters. So in this case, porosity. But if we try to go upscale, we will see that this natural variation is kind of diminishing, and there will come a limit when the natural variation between the macroscopic sample and the microscopic sample will be equal. And that is what a representative elementary volume means. So this means the minimum size of a sample required to characterize a parameter which is consistent across different scales. Now, the vesicular basalt pore network is extremely heterogeneous, and how heterogeneous it is. So this is a plot which can tell you that how heterogeneous this pore size distribution within the vesicular basalt is. So the left-hand side of the plot contains the mostly studied pore networks from Bentheimer, the Beria sandstone, the Keton limestone, and the Castlegate sandstone. And here in the pink and the blue color, you see the pore network distribution from the samples that we collected here. And sometimes we see that presence of macro vesicles, which is more than 3 millimeters of diameter, that we see in here. So it's highly heterogeneous with all the different kinds of pores available in these kinds of rocks. And that is why it is important to establish the REV, because taking a small subsample for a basalt and using it for field scale storage estimation can lead you to very wrong results. The detailed REV workflow used in this study you can find in this paper. So I'm not going into a detailed discussion of it. So if anyone is interested, they are very much welcome to have a look into this paper. Coming to the REV-based effective porosity distribution for the newer volcanic province sample. So we started with a very small cuboid subsample with 10 to the power 3 voxels. And we see that we are not getting any convergence. But as we kept on increasing the voxel sizes, we see that the effective porosity along the three different direction X, Y, and Z starts to converge. Although the convergence is not very good, that we are not able to see a single like histogram bar, but this is what we could get from the sample size that we had. The same pattern was observed for the other sample as well. So we can say that the effective porosity started to converge at a voxel volume, which is 600 cubic voxels, which corresponds to 13,824 millimeter cube. So this is the kind of like sample size in terms of volume that we need to establish the REV for basalt. We tried to do that for permeability, and for permeability, we actually use the least resistance index using the reduced physics flow. So here, we did not find the permeability convergence even at 600 cubic voxel. You see one outlier present in here, and the same for the other sample as well. So we could not establish a least resistance index for permeability for the newer volcanic province basalts. So then we kept the X and Y axis, Y dimension at 600, but we kept on increasing the Z dimension from 600 to 1300. And when we started increasing that, we could start to see some sort of a convergence around 900 or 1000 voxel levels. So the key takeaway is that the cubic subvolumes had to be stretched into elongated cuboids to converge. Otherwise, the convergence we could not see. This is a comparative plot between the siliciclastic rocks and their representative elementary length and the samples that we studied in here. And we can see that more than one order of magnitude of difference in terms of representative elementary volume length is present in basalts. So it literally indicates that the basalt's pore network is highly complex and highly heterogeneous. So from that study from the newer volcanic province, what we actually established is that more than 20,000 millimeter cube voxel size is, sample size is required to kind of get a representative elementary volume where we can have some sort of a confidence. And this is kind of validated by a lab-based permeability and the numerical simulated permeability did on the REV samples. So on the REV samples, the numerical permeability resulted in a value of about 123 millidarcy. And using the same sample in the lab, using the standard core flooding experiments, we found a lab-based permeability, which is 109. So this kind of validates that the statistical REV size model is kind of converging. It's not a very good match, but it's kind of a match that we can go ahead with. So this is like how we establish the REV structure for the basalt. Now the question is, can we use the same REV framework to the Deccan traps? Yes, we can, but how? The answer is we need to reconstruct the pre-secondary mineralization pore network. Now, how can we reconstruct this pre-secondary mineralization pore network? Well, we studied the thin sections of these basalts from the Deccan traps under the microscope. And upon looking at the thin section, what we saw is that the secondary minerals, so this black part is the host basalt, this is the vesicle boundary, and this is smectite, saponite, and zeolite. These are the different types of secondary minerals. The secondary minerals have actually precipitated directly on top of the vesicular basalt wall. The same thing we can see in here as that. So this is the primary basalt matrix. Here we have the first layer of smectite, then we have chlorides, then we have chabazite, which is a type of zeolite. The same we see in here, the same we see in here. So the kind of idea that we got from here is that the secondary mineralization within the vesicles have actually not altered the pre-mineralization vesicle shape or vesicle size. So it actually precipitated directly on top of it without altering the boundary. And therefore, if we can digitally subtract the secondary mineral phases from the 3D volumetrically rendered CT scan images, we can probably reconstruct the pre-secondary mineralization porosity. This is not the primary porosity I'm talking about. This is strictly the pre-secondary mineralization porosity, like what was there before this secondary mineralization actually happened. We did that. So initially with this sample, we saw this is the current state of porosity, and we found no connectivity in this particular sample, which we showed a few slides back. But when we reconstructed the porosity by combining the secondary minerals with the current porosity, we found some connected pore network. And this connectivity has been utilized for the REV analysis for the Deccan. For the REV analysis for the Deccan, the trend is still the same, that the convergence started to happen at 1100 cubic voxels or 1000 cubic voxels. So basically, we still need a very large sample size to kind of come up with some sort of confidence to say, okay, this is the REV for the basalt, and this is what the basalt looks like, and this is what would represent the field scale scenario, and now can be a representative of the storage capacity as well. And we calculated the coefficient of variation as well. Well, for the siliciclastic, if you, we are very familiar that for siliciclastic, we typically use a 5% or 10% of coefficient of variation, but we never get that for the basalt networks. So we kind of restricted, reduced our coefficient of variation to 20% and sometimes to 30%. So this is a kind of a relaxed threshold value that we had to use for our basalts, because it never converged to 10% or 5% values because of the heterogeneity. So this is like a table which is showing that the basalt, the secondary mineral percentage, the current porosity, and the current effective porosity for the different samples taken from the Deccan traps. And the last two columns actually indicated the reconstructed porosity and the reconstructed effective porosity that have been eaten up by the presence of the secondary minerals. So this is basically what the storage opportunity or the storage potential that have been lost for the Deccan trap basalts. Now, this is a very famous equation used for storage estimation. So this is like storage estimation in gigatons. This is area, height, effective porosity, and the efficiency factor. So the efficiency factor, as calculated by McGrail and this person, I barely able to pronounce the name, so I wouldn't dare to. So the storage efficiency factor actually ranges from 18.8 to 48.7. It depends on various factors like the degree of alteration, the presence of different minerals, and so on and so forth. And using this equation, and for our study area, so our study area comprises approximately 2,000 square kilometer. So if we subtract this 2,000 square kilometer area where we have complete mineralization of secondary minerals within the pores, using this equation, what we can estimate is that the proposed storage estimation, the theoretical estimation given by the government of India, which is 94 to 243 gigatons of CO2, it can get reduced by 7 to 18 gigatons. So it will be around 87 to 225 gigatons of CO2. So an area of 2,000 square kilometer alone can have this much impact for the CO2 storage estimation, field scale CO2 storage estimation for the Deccan traps. So the main takeaway from this study is that before we can calculate the storage estimation, it is important to establish the REV for the basalts. That's the first thing. And the second thing is to understand the mineralized state of the basalts by using deeper subsurface samples. Using superficial samples may not help always. Now, since everything is blocked up by secondary minerals, what can we do? Well, we can hydraulically stimulate these basalts. And for hydraulic stimulation, we can test these core samples for different geomechanical tests. So this is what we call the setup for uniaxial compressive stress. So where we put the basalt core samples and we apply pressure. And with this test, we can estimate what we call the uniaxial compressive strength, the Young's modulus, the tensile strength. For tensile strength, the setup is a little bit different, which I have not put in here. And with this test, what we found is that the fracture networks in the basalt have some preferential direction of fracture propagation. For example, if you look closely in this sample, you can see the fractures actually initiated across the interface along the interface between the secondary minerals and the primary basalt. We can also mechanically compute the different geomechanical parameters, because these parameters are needed to understand whether we can hydraulically stimulate the basals and whether it is safe to hydraulically stimulate the basalt, because it can sometimes trigger some sort of seismicity or seismic activity, or sometimes collapse in the subsurface as well. So these are the parameters that we are deducing right now. What's ahead? Next, we have planned. So we have already scanned the post-fracture samples as well. And these post-fracture samples will be used to understand the fracture generation and propagation within the basalt. It will also be used to understand the geomechanical strength properties and the differences between an altered, which is for the Deccan traps, and the unaltered, which is the newer volcanic sample. And it will also be used to understand the enhanced like conductivity and the permeability because of the fracturing. So the conclusion of this study is that in our study area, the Deccan trap is extensively mineralized, and there's a complete loss of effective porosity or connected porosity at present. The second takeaway is basalt's REV is much higher than conventional siliciclastic reservoir rocks, and it is very important to construct a baseline for the REV for basalt before coming up with any sort of storage estimation. Within our study area, we also found that at least 10% effective porosity was present in the samples, which is now completely lost. And this loss has actually resulted in 17 to 18 gigatons of lost CO2 storage potential. The next step is geomechanical testing. With geomechanical testing, we can kind of come up with the idea of mechanical feasibility of hydraulic stimulation and whether that can reopen these basalts again for CO2 utilization and storage. And the next step is to understand the fracture propagation and the fracture generation in basalt, and how the mechanical strength and how maybe the geochemistry as well, because the geochemistry basically affects the mechanical strength. So how all of these affects the fracture propagation and the fracture formation in basalts. So that is important to understand the field scale effect of hydraulic stimulation in basalt networks. So these are the acknowledgements. We acknowledge the Ministry of Earth Sciences for the samples. We acknowledge the director of the Ministry of Earth Sciences. We acknowledge the other persons in the same lab who helped us with sample selection and dispatched the samples. We acknowledge the Traces platform at the University of Melbourne for microcity analysis. We acknowledge Mr. Gordon Home for assistance with thin section preparation, and we acknowledge the Melbourne Research Scholarship, which helped in the conduct of this research. So yeah, if we have any questions, I'm happy to answer. I'm happy to answer your questions. If you have, you can send me an email. So yeah.
Great, thank you so much. That was very interesting. I had a couple of questions. I think the first one was for the permeability. You mentioned that you could make it like a cuboid shape, and I was wondering if that was from like preferential formation of the bubbles, and if that was at all related to the fractures that you saw when you did the hydraulic stimulation.
Yes, the preferential so your question was about like how the fractures are preferentially formed within the networks, is it that?
My question is for the absolute permeability, you were saying that you would not make it a cube, you would make it more like a cuboid shape. And I was wondering if that was related to one, the formation of the vesicles, and two, if that was at all related to the fracture formation.
Oh, yeah, I got it. No, it is not related to the fracture formation. It is like the intact sample before the fracturing happened. But increasing the cuboid length actually helped in getting the REV, because with increasing length, the underlying algorithm started to capture more subsamples within the like region of interest for our sample. And with that, it started to converge, because it is now getting a more distributed pore network channel, I would say. So probably that's the main reason why with the increasing cuboid length, we started to see some sort of convergence. And the permeability as well.
Did it matter like which way you were extending like the cuboid in terms of like the direction from which the core was taken? Like was there some clear anisotropy in your samples, or it just meant like you had to have a slightly bigger REV?
Yeah, we just had to have a slightly bigger REV because we could only extend it along the Z direction. We are restricted from X and Y because we had a standard core, and then we like took a cuboid sample from it. So we could not extend along X and Y. So we had to extend along Z only. And with extending along Z, we started to see that the coefficient of variation started to converge in a better way.
Okay, great. And I had one more question. Your REV permeability from the simulation versus the lab-based, the simulation one was slightly higher. Is there a reason for that? I would have thought typically that the calculated permeability would be lower if you're missing these key small connections.
Yes, we think so. Because if you look at the like diagrams, you will see that we did not get a proper convergence of the permeability in terms of the coefficient of variation. So there was still some sort of a scatter. So I think that is the reason that the lab-based permeability was a bit lower than the numerically simulated permeability. Yes.
Okay, interesting. Great. Thank you so much. So I'd like to thank both our speakers for their presentations today. They were both very interesting, so thank you so much. And then before we close the session, I just want to advertise our next Porous Media Tea Time talk, which will be on the 22nd of September, and we're going back to the more European-friendly time of 5 p.m. Central European time, and we have an American special next month with 2 talks from American universities. We have Christopher Allison and Hamdi Dereza Adiyan. Butchered this slightly, from Boise State University, USA. And so with that, I would like to close out today's talk. Thank our speakers again. And if you're interested in any of our activities, please scan this barcode here by the InterPore Young Academy. Great, right here. So with that, thank you so much for joining us. And if you have any questions for our speakers, please feel free to email them.